Hello, it's Mr. Mulvey again with another one of my fantastic science lessons. Today we're going to be focusing on cell division, specifically the cell cycle. Well, first of all, what is cell division? Cell division is the process where a cell produces more cells by splitting in two. So if you watch this blue cell, it's going to split into two cells. Now those two cells eventually will then split into four cells, and four cells into 8 cells, and 8 cells into 16 cells. And this process will just continue on and on and on and on in an organism until we have a ton of cells. So how does this relate to you? Is this even happening inside of your body right now? Well, the answer to that question is yes. So in order to grow from one cell into the baby that you used to be, it took more cells. Cells had to divide. In order to grow from a baby into the wonderful adult that you will someday become, it will take more cells, which are created through, you guessed it, cell division. Well, that's great, Mr. Mulvey, but why do cells need to divide other than to grow me up from a baby into adult? Well, this relates to more than just humans. So we're going to focus first on multicellular or many-celled organisms. So what do they need their cells to divide in order to do? Well, as we already talked about, organisms need cell division in order to grow. You need more building materials to make something bigger. So plants, fungi, animals, humans, even some protists all need to grow. Also, development, which if you remember from earlier discussions if you're in my class, development is where an organism becomes more complex. In order for those more complex tissues to form, we need more cells. So a good example of complexity, probably one of the most extreme examples of development that I can think of, is a tadpole, like the one seen here, starting to grow legs. Now eventually that tadpole will change into a frog. So there are a lot of things going on with gills turning into lungs and legs growing, going from completely being in the water to being able to completely be on land. Another need is to repair injuries. If an organism is injured, cut, burned, something is cut off, oftentimes it will need to regrow or at least heal in order for that organism to survive. In order to do that, we need more cells to replace what was lost in that injury. Cells, like living things, or other living things should I say, have a lifespan. So another reason for cell division is to replace old, worn-out cells. That keeps the organism functioning most efficiently, and of course it's going to expand the lifespan of an organism. And then lastly, which this is not the entire list, but the last thing I'm going to discuss is to produce reproductive cells. So those cells that are used in order to reproduce or make more organisms, just like this chicken is laying eggs. So other than multicellular organisms, hopefully you remember or know that there are other types of organisms known as unicellular organisms, or organisms that are only made of one single cell. Single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, reproduce primarily by cell division. So you'll see that this organism, this bacterial cell, splits into two cells. Of course, it has to do some things first, which we'll talk about here in the next sections, but it splits in two in order to make more of itself. But wait, the title said something about the cell cycle. So how does that even relate to cell division? Well, the cell cycle itself is a process of growth, replication, and division that cells undergo. Now, one thing to remember is that the cell cycle is dealing with somatic or non-reproductive cells. So in other words, body cells. The cell cycle itself is broken up into three main stages. The first stage being interphase, the second stage being mitosis, and the third stage being cytokinesis. Now, as this is a cycle, the cell cycle does not just stop at cytokinesis. the cell goes right back through to interphase, and the two cells that were created go through the cell cycle again, and it keeps going on and on and on. So now I'm going to talk about each individual stage of the cell cycle. So the first one, hopefully you remember, is called interphase. So during interphase, the cell actually doubles in size, so it becomes twice as large as it originally was. Now that makes sense when you think about the fact that everything, including the genetic material inside of that cell, is doubling, and that process is known as DNA replication, at least for the genetic material copying. So if you wanted to make something twice its size and have everything that was originally in that first thing, you would have to double it first before you split it in half. It makes sense. It's interphase. So this is sort of like a copying machine, copying everything. The second stage in the cell cycle is called mitosis. Now in mitosis, the nucleus, that's the region in the near the center of the cell that contains the genetic material, often called the brain of the cell. But the nucleus divides into two separate nuclei, and the genetic material that's inside is divided between those two developing cells. Now this is actually a four-stage process that we'll discuss in a little bit. So just like scissors cutting a ribbon in two, that nucleus is also cut into two parts. The third stage in the cell cycle is called cytokinesis. During this stage, the cytoplasm and the organelles, those little tiny cell parts that perform specific jobs, are divided between both developing cells. Now, this stage is where that cell completely splits in two, forming two identical daughter cells. Congratulations, we have twins. So moving back one stage in the cell cycle, we're going to talk about mitosis. Now I said earlier that that was divided into four individual stages or phases. So the individual phases of mitosis in order are prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. Now, the way that I remember at least the first letters of the four phases of mitosis in order is with the following sentence. Please make a turkey. Now, at the time that I made this screencast, and at the time that I always teach this in my classes, it's always around Thanksgiving. So this makes perfect sense. So PMAT, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, please make a turkey. So now, what happens during each of those individual phases of mitosis? Well, first of all, we have prophase. During prophase, the chromatin, which is that squiggly stuff seen here in the middle of the circle, which represents the nucleus, it condenses or squeezes together to form these structures. Now, each of these little rods that you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of these X-looking structures, which we'll call chromosomes, are called chromatids. So those chromatids, when they're stuck together or doubled, they are chromosomes. Now, you'll also see these lines at the top. They're called a spindle fiber or spindle fibers, plurally. They will form a bridge from one end of the cell to the other. And the nuclear membrane, this blue structure, around the genetic material will dissolve. Moving on, we get to metaphase. So during metaphase, the chromosomes actually line up across the middle of the cell. So you see they make a nice, neat line. And these structures, which once again are called spindle fibers, will connect to these little yellow structures, which are called centromeres. Centromeres kind of hold those chromatids together as chromosomes. Now, these spindle fibers will eventually play a very important job in separating that genetic material to opposite ends of the cell. Hey, let's stand in line. The next stage is called anaphase. During anaphase, those chromosomes, which lined up in the middle of the cell during metaphase, are pulled to opposite ends of the cell by the spindle fibers. I didn't put any spindle fibers in the picture because I want to keep the focus on those chromosomes splitting in half. Okay? They are moving to opposite ends of the cell. The last stage of mitosis is called telophase. Now, during telophase, the cell has become even more stretched out looking. It's pinching in the middle. We're getting these areas that are called furrows. And we have genetic material in two separate areas. That's going to be important because both of the daughter cells that are created next are going to need genetic material. During this stage, the nuclear membranes will form around both sets of genetic material, so we will have two completely separate nuclei. So just to recap, when we're talking about the three main stages of the cell cycle, mitosis was defined as a stage where the nucleus divides in two. So if you remember, the first stage of mitosis, prophase, we had one nucleus, and now we have two completely individual sets of genetic material into nuclei. So what would happen after telophase? Can you remember? That's right, cytokinesis. So that's when the cell will actually cut in two. Now just remember, during telophase, they're getting close to dividing, but they haven't completely separated yet. So congratulations, we've gotten through mitosis, all right? And this dog, just like the nuclear material, the genetic material in the nucleus, is surrounded by balloons, just like the nuclear membrane. So let's review, all right? For each of the questions that follow, pause the video and try and think of an answer. Now, if you need to, please do go back and review the segments of the video that relate if necessary. All right, so first review question. What are 3 reasons why multicellular organisms need their cells to divide? Question 2. How do unicellular organisms use cell division? Question 3. What are the 3 main stages of the cell cycle? Question 4. What kinds of cells are produced during the cell cycle? Question 5. What happens during each of the 3 main stages of the cell cycle? Question 6. What are the 4 phases of mitosis? Question 7. What happens during each of the 4 stages of mitosis? And finally, question 8. How are each of the phases of mitosis similar and different from each other? Alright, well that's the end of this video on the cell cycle. So I'd like to thank you for watching. Please check back later for more of my wonderful science explanations and videos.